Hello and welcome to the IHTA seminar, Town and Country Perspectives from the Irish Historic Towns Atlas. And to today's session, Lawyers, Merchants and Peasants, Town and Country Interaction in Early Modern Ireland. I am Sarah Gearty, Cartographic and Managing Editor with the Irish Historic Towns Atlas, which is a research project of the Royal Irish Academy, Dublin. I'd like to welcome you, our virtual audience. Usually we will be together in the meeting room of Academy House, Dawson Street, but I can tell you that it's raining and storming here in Dublin, so perhaps on this occasion we are actually better off where we are. So we have almost 1,000 people registered and signed up for this seminar, so you are not alone, and I see we have 124 attendees and counting joining us today, so welcome one and all. Today is the third in the series, which is running through May, with lectures each Thursday lunchtime. It is convened in association with our colleagues in the British Historic Towns Atlas, the Historic Towns Trust. We've been taking a chronological approach with our theme, Town and Country, and we have already had monastic tenants, Viking raiders and Highburn and Norse townspeople with Howard Clark and Ruth Johnson. And last week, of course, we had Town and Country in later medieval Ireland. That was with Michael Potterton, Jim Galloway and Margaret Murphy. And if you've missed those and are joining us for the first time today, those are online and available to watch via ihta.ie. And I think Jennifer is going to include the links in the Q&A panel as well, so you can catch up on those there. Today we are moving into early modern Ireland with lawyers, merchants and peasants, town and country interaction in early modern Ireland. And before I have the pleasure of introducing our speakers for today, Raymond Gillespie and Brendan Scott, some practicalities. Audience cameras are off and mics are muted, but please do get involved by using the webinar's interactive features. You can submit your questions to the two speakers at any stage during the presentations, and we encourage you to do that, please, as they occur to you. To do it, you need to use the Q&A facility in the control panel. And then at the end of the presentations, both presentations, the questions will be published and the speakers will address as many of your questions as they can. And depending on how many questions there are, we may go over time, but the recording will be available afterwards if you have to leave at 2 o'clock on the dot. Our producer for today is Jennifer Moore and our IT specialist is Alan Jacob. We are recording this seminar and we'll share the link at a later date. And if you would like to tweet about the event, the hashtag is #IHTA2021. And now may I introduce you to the first of today's two speakers, and that is Professor Raymond Gillespie, who lectures in the Department of History in Maynooth University. He is a member of the Royal Irish Academy. He's the chair of the Honorary Editorial Board of the Irish Historic Towns Atlas. He's widely published in early modern Irish history, and as many of you here will know, he is much more besides. Lawyers, merchants and peasants, Town and Country Interaction in Early Modern Ireland, live from Rhetoric House, Maynooth University. Over to you, Raymond.
Thanks very much, Sarah. Those of you who have soldiered with us over the last 2 weeks have learnt at least a little about how towns and countryside in Ireland before 1500 interacted. And in particular, the stress has been on the economy, trading, food supply, fuel, the practicalities of everyday life. Now, in part, that sort of view of the interaction between town and country is the product of the medieval sources. By the time that we move into the 16th and 17th centuries, when the sources begin to develop, we begin to see other aspects of the relationship between town and country. So what I want to do today is to try and broaden our perspective on the relationship between town and country. And then when I've done that, Brendan will come back to talk about the more well-worn themes of economy and traders. To widen the perspective, so to speak, on how towns interacted with their countryside. We could do worse than to follow the antiquarian and early scientist Samuel Molyneux, who in 1708 had a tour into Ulster from Dublin. He travelled north through the Boyne Valley, up into South Armagh, and from South Armagh stopping to see his own estates in Armagh, he pushed north. He left an account of this tour, of how he passed through the Lagan Valley, pausing at gentlemen's seats, and the towns that he encountered along the way. Now, for Molyneux, the small towns, or the relatively small towns of Lurgan and Lisburn, as well as the larger urban centres that he visited, Armagh and Belfast, were very different social constructs from the world in which he passed through during the day, the surrounding countryside. Now, this was not based on legal or abstract functions, which is what historians have usually used to define towns, but rather on the practicalities of what he saw. Towns, small or large, were more densely occupied than the surrounding countryside. And this is one thing that strikes you very forcefully from Molyneux. We know that when he entered a town, he knew he had entered a town, not by a legal definition or an economic definition, but simply there were a lot more houses around. There were also different sorts of buildings. There were shops that one didn't find in the surrounding countryside. Those who lived in the houses in the towns were engaged in industrial activity, particularly linen weaving and pottery manufacture that Molyneux couldn't find in the surrounding countryside. Urban dwellers also had markets that could be seen with traders buying and selling. The army and the church were both visible in towns, but not in the countryside. So for Molyneux, therefore, the urban and rural worlds that interacted performed complementary functions, one feeding off the other, and both operating together. And therefore, because they were complementary, they needed to exchange their specialisms. And what towns had to offer to rural dwellers had been largely shaped over the century and a half before Molyneux's journey. In the early 16th century, towns, as Molyneux understood them, had not existed in the north and west of Ireland. Only around the coastal margins of southern, eastern, and western Ireland had towns developed in the Middle Ages under Anglo-Norman influence. In the north and west of the country, the commercial economy was poorly developed, centralised government non-existent, and custom, rather than common law, framed social arrangements. That's not to say that settlements did not exist. At cathedrals, for example, we see clusters of houses, and very often these were also places where fairs met and merchants could come from outside and exchange. But Molyneux would not have recognised this as a town in the way that he recognised the towns that he passed through the Lagan Valley. Now, somewhere between these two zones, the zone of urbanisation in the south and west, and the zone where there were no towns to the north and east, there was an interface with poorly developed urban forms such as Longford, Mullingar, or Cavan, a transitional zone between the world of commerce and the world which was much less commercial. A transitional zone between lordship over men, which was characteristic of Gaelic Ireland, and lordship over land, that was characteristic of Anglo-Norman Ireland. In the course of the 16th and 17th centuries, Ireland underwent a series of linked revolutions in law, land ownership, economic organisation, and government, partly generated by colonisation, partly by plantation, partly by commercialisation, and partly by influences from wider continental Europe. And together, these revolutions interacted to change the face of the Irish landscape. One aspect of this was the emergence of towns, and the functions that those towns would provide to the surrounding countryside were determined by the circumstances of their origins. In most cases, a triumvirate of actors shaped these early towns. Government agencies, often directly through plantation schemes, local landlords, and less commonly in the early 17th century, but more commonly in the late 17th century, mercantile interests. Thus, for those who did not live in towns, the reasons for moving into them, either on a temporary or a permanent basis, tended to be linked to these variables. That is, they were motives of administration, the government, or economic, the merchant or the landlord. Now, despite these very broad generalizations, it's worth putting in a couple of caveats. It's worth remembering that these, for those who experienced towns, for those who travelled from the surrounding countryside into them, this was not a simple pre-orchestrated urban experience which was standardised. Few people came to towns, for example, with a single aim in mind. One might come to buy and sell, but one saved up their business until a journey was really merited. Thus, when a rural tenant came to town to sell his product, he also had other interests in mind. He might want to buy, for example. He might want to buy luxuries that he couldn't buy at home, such as tobacco. He wanted to be entertained on a day out. Thus, the Quaker William Edmondson, for example, at Derry in 1657 or 1658, we're not sure which, recorded his visit of being on a market day when normally the business would be for buying and selling from tenants from the surrounding countryside. But in the marketplace, there were stage players and rope dancers, and an abundance of people gathered, as he described. This was pure entertainment. In the All, for example, in the market house, plays were put on at the same time. So people came into the countryside, from the countryside to the town, for many reasons: for entertainment, for economic reasons, for administrative reasons, and so on. Visits to a town could be of varying length and for trivial or serious reasons. Many, for example, from rural England or Scotland, who settled in Ireland in the 17th century, passed through port towns, for example, on their way to a predominantly rural existence. Sometimes that was their only exposure to a very large urban settlement. Belfast, for example, we know from a list from the early 1630s, had very large numbers of people from England and Scotland passing through it, but none of them were there 10 years later. In other words, these people had moved out into the surrounding countryside, probably never to visit a town on the side of Belfast. Again, those who predominantly lived in a rural world might only encounter a town for a prolonged period because they fled to it in a time of crisis, such as the outbreak of the insurrection of 1641 or later in 1688. Equally, and I think it's worth remembering this as well, those who lived in towns, if the experience of towns was fleeting for those from the countryside, equally for those who lived in towns, they were never far removed from the surrounding countryside. Most urban leaseholders, for example, had plots of land assigned to them around the town, in the fields which surrounded towns. And this allowed them to supplement the food supplies that they would normally acquire from the market. Houses in towns often had long gardens behind them where pigs and other animals were kept. It's worth remembering, for example, that the largest single occupational description for those who lived in the town of Athy, County Kildare, in 1641 was a rural description, yeoman. Towns were far from being isolated from their countryside. Those who lived in towns had an intimate relationship with the countryside. And those in the countryside had a range of relationships with towns, everything from the very fleeting to the very continuous. Now, this raises the most immediate question of attitudes of town dwellers to the countryside, and indeed vice versa. Now, two examples I think will help us to demonstrate the wide variety of attitudes that existed in both town and countryside to each other. One from the very recent urbanised world of the plantation of Ulster, Lurgan, and the other from a very long settled and well urbanised area of South Leinster. That is, these two areas that I've talked about of almost no towns being introduced in the 17th century, and where I compared with the area which was already well urbanised. Athy was a medieval settlement on the River Barrow. Its importance, of course, was the Barrow as a communications corridor down into the southern part of Ireland. It was therefore a very important communication centre, a market centre, a market town. It was also a corporate town. That is, it had its own structure of government. We know from the depositions which were taken from those in the rebellion, or shortly after the outbreak of the rebellion in 1642, where we have the descriptions of 67 households out of probably 110 at the time, so more than half the population, has living in it a constable, a marshal, a provost, that is, a whole administration for the town. The occupational structure of the town: clothier, skinner, spurrier, blacksmith, feltmaker, innkeeper, carrier, maltster, carpenter, tailor, butcher, two broodmakers, cooper, baker, four merchants, and so on. In other words, what this is a relatively well-developed industrial structure, clearly and separately defined from the surrounding countryside. The town had invested in 3 mills, which was, of course, to control the food supply of the town. The town had tried to have control over some of its own food supply. So town and countryside, in the case of Athy, were relatively clearly divorced. Athy clearly did see itself as separate from the countryside, as an almost quasi-industrial settlement, although still very much connected to the town, also very much separate from it, and therefore a particular type of social formation. Contrast that with Lurgan in County Armagh. Very strong similarities. Lurgan, like Athy, sits in a valley, a very important communication centre, in this case, the Lagan Valley. Lurgan was a market town, just like Athy. By 1700, they were both of roughly the same size. But yet, Lurgan and its relationship with the countryside around it was very different. Lurgan was recently founded. It had been founded by William Brownlow, who had been granted land in the Ulster plantation. It was not a corporate town. It was dominated by its landlord. Its occupational structure in 1622, when we have lists, said of the 50 residents, roughly half were yeomen or husbandmen. That is, the sort of designations which were applied to those outside, in comparison to roughly 1/6 of the town. It did have occupations: joiners, turners, coopers, shoemakers, masons, weavers, smiths, tanners, carpenters, butchers, but no mills. It's much more of a village rather than a town, much more closely integrated with the rural world around it. Many of those who lived in the town had land immediately outside it and would have described themselves, even though they lived in the town, as farmers. What these two towns show you, I think, are two very, very different balances between town and countryside. Two very different sorts of interactions between these two settlements. While people naturally came into Lurgan because that's where they lived, even though they had land in the countryside, where people naturally move between the rural and urban worlds and learn with great frequency in a time it required a particular decision to come into that world, to avail of the industrial products there. They were old and new settlements, and that pattern is replicated across Ireland. So when we talk about relationship between town and countryside, we are talking really about a very complicated pattern of relationships. Not one simple relationship, but a very complicated pattern of relationships, much of which depends on how these towns are evolving early on. Now, don't worry, it's not as fragmented and as disastrous with no clear patterns as perhaps I have tried to suggest. If I take a second comparison, that is a comparison between, again, an old area, an old, well-urbanized area, and a new one, let us look at the similarities and differences between Kilkenny and Armagh. There are, of course, two very different. They are very different. As with Athy and Lurgan, Kilkenny was a trading and a manufacturing centre, quite a large one. Armagh was much more of a social centre. But there were very strong similarities. There were real things in those towns which drew people in from the surrounding countryside into those towns for similar reasons. Both were cathedral towns. People went into towns for religion. Both were county towns. That is, they provided a set of administrative services, and both were market towns. And there we have, I think, the triumvirate of elements which determine the shape of interaction between town and countryside. The church, the county town, the administrative centre, and the market town. And we could pair two towns off in the same way, for example, between Derry and Kilkenny. You would get a very similar result. Now, with these sort of caveats, let's just go back to return to Molyneux's experience. What were the towns that he saw and what attracted people in? And let's begin, first of all, with the town as administrative centre. And as the authority of the Dublin administration spread throughout the whole island in the 16th, 17th centuries, it became essential for the exercise of royal power and authority in Ireland. The new state and the idea of the town were very, very closely linked. And progress in developing one depended on the spread of the other. Now, at the pinnacle of this system is Dublin, the administrative centre of government and the seat of the law courts. And it's these courts, more than anything else, that attract people in from the countryside. If you look at the 1641 depositions for Dublin, it's remarkable how many people from Monaghan are in Dublin on the eve of the rising. And why are they there? Well, they're there to buy and sell. Yes, they're buying tobacco to take back into the countryside to sell it. Packmen, peddlers are there, the bridges between town and country, who bring goods from one into the other. But much more importantly, there were people from Monaghan McMahons looking for writs, collecting debts, looking for administrative functions. And for those higher in the social scale, they were looking for advice from professionals, and in particular, legal professionals. The landlord, for example, of Newton Ards, Colville, in the 1670s, wrote to his friend saying it was terrible that he was away from Dublin, where he could not get any legal advice at all. So that legal advice, and this is a world with an emerging common law system, became very important. That is at the peak of the social pyramid. People moving into Dublin for legal cases, for legal advice. But let's move it down a little bit more. And the very local administration reproduces the Dublin world almost exactly. The assizes, for example, was the law in Dublin manifesting itself in the locality. Coming to the assize town, And it was this process that the planners of the Ulster plantation thought civility would spread among the native Irish. By going to the assizes, by meeting people at markets, they would learn new ways. And they were right. Because from the 1620s, we start to see the language of the law appearing in barley porter. They were picking up these ideas from the assize. That legal reasons pulled you into your local assize time, whether it was because you were accused of something, or whether because you were part of the county administration. And it's worth remembering that the origins of the grand jury lie in exactly this situation, where the freemen from the county would move into the assize town at the time of the assize, and while they were there, they would plan the building of roads and bridges and the setting of the county cess. So that the product and interaction in town and countryside produces the county administration, so to speak. This was also where proclamations were read, where the will of the Dublin government was revealed to those in the localities, often read out and also nailed on the door of the county sessions house, so those people in the town could read them. In other words, this interaction around the law became the way of, if you like, communicating the ways in which Ireland, and particularly local Ireland, was to be governed to people from the town into the local countryside. And let's move down yet one stage further to the very local courts, the manor courts, things which we know frustratingly little about. But the local courts were places, these manorial courts, were places where landlords ran their estates. And where were the manorial courts held? In towns. So that those for the Thomond estate in parts of Clare were in the main held in towns of Ennis, for example, the Herbert estate on Castle Island, the Brownlow estate on Lurgan, the Montgomery estate in Donaghadee, and so on I could go. And some towns even went to the expense of building a particular manorial courthouse. Dungarvan, for example, at the beginning of the 18th century, builds a very considerable house which is intended for the administration of the manorial courts. This is what drew people in from outside, to pay their rents, to negotiate new leases, to have their rows sorted out by the agent, and the manor court meeting in the main, in the town, was the mechanism by which this was to be done. Now, of course, it's not just secular administration, because towns, as we would see from Armagh, also had ecclesiastical administration attached to them. And indeed, if anything, in the 17th and 18th centuries, the role of churches in this sphere expanded considerably. One very obvious example of this is the question of education, rigidly under the control of the church. And in the late 17th and 18th centuries, we see the establishment of a whole series of schools, both by the church and also by the state, so that the initiatives that are taken by the state, for example, the charter schools movement in the 18th century, is based entirely on towns. So those who want anything more than very basic literacy, and by basic literacy I mean the ability to read, if you wanted to progress beyond that, you needed to go to a town, because schools in the main were associated with towns. Cathedrals, for example, had always drawn in people from the countryside. We haven't said much about pilgrimage up till now, but in the Middle Ages, for example, there are pilgrims moving from countryside into town, for example, in Tuam, or in Dublin, Christchurch in Dublin, for the large relic collection there. There is a considerable movement of people from town, from countryside into town, and back again into the countryside. And of course, cathedrals had done more than simply move people, they moved money. Because cathedrals were endowed with livings or land, and sometimes both, outside the town, but the people who occupied them were, as part of the bishop's household in the town, they drew their income from those livings into the town. That is, they pulled money from the countryside into the town, as well as pulling people. Now, in the 17th century, that pattern intensifies very considerably. And there is a move, if you like, to create more and more churches in towns. Traditionally, Irish churches have been rural, but increasingly in the 17th century, towns are rebuilt, or churches are rebuilt in towns. For example, when towns are rebuilt, Bandon or Derry, the churches are created within those towns. Older churches are relocated. Drumglass, for example, is the parish in which Dungannon stands, but in the 17th century, Dungannon, the old church of Drumglass, is closed down and a new church is built in the town. Again, in Donegal, Cavan and Raphoe is moved into Lettertown. So there is a move to draw churches into town. So to go to church on a Sunday morning, if you are a member of the established church, involves you moving into a town, and consequently, again. For Catholics, the experience is rather different. As far as we can reconstruct, in the early part of the 17th century, Catholicism, Mass, is usually said in the countryside, as far away from towns as you can get. But certainly by the late 17th century, and certainly by the early 18th century, we see increasingly churches, Catholic churches, built in towns. Some of them very dramatic, but the Dublin ones are the most dramatic. But certainly outside, the Catholic churches created in towns to serve the parishes around them. So what we're seeing, therefore, is a whole range of variables. Lawyers and the law draw, as that common law world expands in the 17th century, so this draws people into towns, returning back to the countryside again. Again, as religion, patterns of religion change, again, drawing people into the towns and back into the countryside. So the administration, lawyers, and religion serve to shape the way in which people in towns see the countryside. There is one much larger way in which people in the countryside see the towns, and that is through the market. Again, a new innovation of the 16th and 17th centuries. And Brendan Scott is now going to talk about the market.
Thank you very, very much, Raymond. That was marvellous. And before I hand over to Brendan, as Jennifer is just getting things set up in the background, just to remind you that if you've got questions on what Raymond spoke about there, please put them in to the Q&A panel and we will deal with them at the end of the session together, when we'll have both panelists live and responding. And also, just to say, if you've missed the earlier sessions in this seminar series, Jennifer, I think, has put the links to those up in the Q&A panel as well, so you can find them there. And this, of course, is being recorded. So if you've missed the beginning of this for any reason, you will be able to go back and look at that again. So rest assured on that. So if I may now introduce our next speaker, Dr. Brendan Scott. He'll be joining us in a minute. Dr. Brendan Scott is the manager of the Irish Family History Foundation and lectures part-time at Maynooth University. He is co-author with Jonathan Cherry on the Irish Historic Towns Atlas of Cavan and was editor of the book Society and Administration of Ulster's Plantation Towns, published in 2019 by Four Courts Press. Brendan and Raymond have collaborated on various projects in the past, and Brendan, we are delighted to have you with us today. So lawyers, merchants and peasants, town and country interaction in early modern Ireland, the second part. Over to you, Brendan.
Markets and fairs underpinned trade and commerce in late medieval and early modern Ireland, and they provided a compelling reason for rural dwellers to visit urban centres on a regular or semi-regular basis. The fair, which was normally an annual or perhaps a biannual occurrence, was generally associated with the feast of a particular saint, For example, in Kildare, the fair was held on the 1st of February, which is the Feast of St. Bridget. And they could sometimes run over a number of days. To be granted the right to hold a fair was a great financial benefit for a town, accruing, as they did, significant financial income from them in the form of taxes and tolls from the people who attended and took part in these fairs. But the main commercial focal point for these towns was the weekly market, which was generally a one-day affair, held on the same day each week, so on every Thursday of every week, or whatever it would be. And this was a chance for smaller, less specialized traders to sell their wares on a regular basis, or perhaps if they were selling goods that had a limited lifespan, like milk or whatever it may be. And so they would be selling things like perishable goods, foodstuffs, things like that. And as such, the weekly market and the fairs as well attracted people from outside the towns who would visit to sample and perhaps purchase the various goods on offer, and also to come to the town and sell their goods as well. In the early modern period, new towns, many of them incorporated, were established throughout Ireland, including 107 new markets in Munster, mostly in the 1610s, with 2/3 of these granted to new English landlords. Many of these new towns established or incorporated in Ireland in the early 17th century had designated areas set aside for markets and fairs to accommodate the larger numbers of people that would come in on those particular days. It was also ordered that the plantation counties of Ulster should have a convenient number of market towns and corporations erected for the habitation and settling of tradesmen and artificers. The Charter for Dungannon, for example, issued on the 27th of November 1612, prioritised building projects in the town, such as the building of a parish church, a school and a marketplace, all of which would make the town a more attractive prospect for potential settlers. Merchants were sometimes expected as well to contribute to the upkeep of the areas in which they traded. So the market square, they were expected to pay towards the upkeep of it. And fishermen in Clonmel, for example, were told in the 17th century to pave the area where they sold their wares. So they had to make sure that that area was paved and kept as well on that particular spot where they set up and sold from. Streetscapes were also designed to accommodate the markets and those attending them, such as Fethard Street, which widened into a triangular area at the eastern end for precisely that purpose. That was also a feature of some Irish medieval towns like Ennis, where the markets were held at a point where 3 streets met to form a triangular space in the middle of the town. So it became a natural, open, wide point in which you could set up, and which wouldn't create too much of a bottleneck, I suppose, coming in and out of that particular area. Separate areas were also developed in some towns for the buying and selling of animals, like the cow market in Belturbet. You wouldn't traipse your animals up and down the main streets of these towns and the mess that they would leave behind and so on. So instead, you'd trade the animals just outside the town or behind the town. And I have a map here of Belturbet in 1723. And this area here is the main street going down here. And at the back of the town is what they call the cow market. So that's where the fair green still lies in Belturbet to this day. But Belfast in 1639 attempted to address this problem of animals by finding any traders who didn't keep their livestock in the pens provided, because obviously they could go wandering or whatever, and so in Belfast you would be fined if you didn't keep your animals in the pens. Poor towns like Carrickfergus, whose market was held on what was described as a handsome large street, often, but not always, as we'll see, developed their markets close to the quays. So if we take a look at Carrickfergus here, this is a map of Carrickfergus in 1560, and you can again see the widening of the street down towards the quay, and this area here is where the market would have been held. This is the market cross there in the middle as well, and so that gives you a nice idea of the way that the town widens to that central focal point where the market would be held. Colerane's Saturday market was initially held outside the town before being moved to within the town's precincts, so they actually moved that one in as well. Trade was a mainstay in Bandon, and it's no surprise that the largest and most prominently sited secular buildings in Bandon and in Sligo as well were the market houses. In a number of towns which emerged as pre-Norman ecclesiastical communities, what is now the marketplace lay east or southeast of the church, in the same direction as the church entrance itself. And that was the case in Kildare, for example, although Downpatrick is one notable exception to that particular rule. Now, not all towns were so well planned, however, and Youghall's marketplace, for example, by the end of the 13th century was quite narrow and described as being rather claustrophobic. Londonderry's market area immediately following the plantation there lacked the necessary storage facilities or even weights, even though the quay there was reckoned to be the largest one in Ireland. While in Coleraine, the custom house was situated in the middle of the town, well away from the quays, and was described as being little bigger than a cobbler's shop. Plainly an unsatisfactory situation for everybody there. Now, as we've seen in the map of Carrickfergus there, the marketplace was often signified by the erection of a market cross, a common sight during the medieval and early modern periods. And they were set up so people, again, who weren't from the town, who were visiting, coming in from wherever, would know where the market was to be, if there were traders, where the general area in which to set up. So it was a market, it was a focal point for this business. And you see numerous ones around the country. There was one, as I say, in Carrickfergus by the mid-16th century. Navan had one by the mid-1580s. Cavan had one in the 1590s. Bandon had one by 1613. Clonmel had one in 1629. And Longford had one by the mid-17th century. And this is the one in Cavan. This is what is now the main street in Cavan town. And just at the top of what's now Bridge Street, again, was the market cross. And you can see it's the widest area in the middle of the town there. And so, again, it would have been the easiest to move in and out of, because you had a number of roadways that you could, or streetways, that you could come in and out of there. The market cross from Navan, for example, has survived to this day and is decorated with crests and text designed to impress upon people the story of the town and those who founded it. So it was almost like a little information panel, the like of which you would see like in tourism spots now, you know, telling you this is such and such a thing. And the market cross would tell the same story. So it's nice that the one in Navan is still there. Now, not all of these crosses were new, and some of them were recycled. For example, the market cross in Kells was a 9th century high cross, which was repurposed as a market cross. And by 1627, the fair in Sligo was held at what was called Bishop O'Crean's Cross, which had been erected around 1570. Occasionally, even natural stone outcrops were used as market markers rather than market crosses themselves. And that was the case in the north end of New Street in Dublin, where a natural feature there was complemented in the early 16th century by another marker known as the Freeman's Stone. Now, as has been noted elsewhere, town charters put in place a framework for both the governance of the town and its economic development, particularly through the granting of rights to hold fairs and markets. And in 1583, for example, a charter issued to Mullingar granted them 2 annual fairs of 4 days each, and authorised to spend its income on these fairs, from these fairs, on the construction of town walls, making it a safer environment in which to live and work, and to make it a more attractive option for people, again, from outside the town to go and visit on those market days. They knew they had a certain measure of safety when they were there, I suppose. Now, incorporation generally went hand in hand with the granting of a market as well, which would be, as I say, an important source of revenue for a town's corporation. And in 1685 and in 1705, Belturbat's corporation, in their minute books, set out the charges to be imposed upon sales at market and on the traders themselves. So it gives an indication of the type of goods and the type of merchants who were operating in the town at that period, as well as the profit that the town's corporation was making off the people who were trading on those market and fair days. Extra fees were charged, for example, if a trader erected a stall rather than sold their goods on the ground, which probably applied, these guys who were selling on the ground, probably applied to visiting traders who laid their goods out on a cloth or a movable, collapsible table or something like that. But some towns also saw the development or repurposing of more permanent buildings as shops to handle the burgeoning trade in these towns. As they got bigger, people realized, well, we don't just have to sell on the market day or on the fair day. We can have a shop here, 24/7, as it were. And Belfast's economy, for example, appears to have been wealthy enough that by 1639, permanent structures were in situ at the marketplace rather than the temporary stalls that were more common for use during markets and fairs. The more permanent nature of those buildings, I suppose, sort of indicates a confidence in the consumption market and the long-term plans of the settler community to remain in Ulster. And they also obviously felt that enough people were coming in, enough people were in the town first off to keep it going, and also enough people were visiting the town from elsewhere, from outside the town, were coming in and buying goods. And so they felt, well, we're obviously making enough money from both markets, if you like, and so they felt, well, we can set up more permanent structures and put down roots here. Like in Belturbat by 1641, there were at least 2 shopkeepers, 6 merchants who may have had specialised premises, as well as 17 others who traded as bakers, clothiers, tanners, innkeepers, coopers, shoemakers, felt makers, butchers and turners. And some of those would have kept shops of some kind in which to work and trade. Now, one of these merchants, a guy called Edward Denman, having fled to Dublin following the outbreak of the Rising in October 1641, actually returned to Belturbat at some point during the winter of 1641 in an unsuccessful attempt to recover the estimated £500 worth of goods which were stored in his shop. So it gives you an indication of the amount and the value of goods that some of these merchants were holding. And some of the merchants were holding much more, far more in terms of value than Denman was. So, these guys were setting up permanent structures and had plenty of goods on site ready to sell. Now, the substantial income accrued from these markets and fairs meant that the rights attached to them were guarded jealously by the town corporations. Colerane's corporation, for example, authorises 1650 an official to investigate whether other markets were operating within 7 miles of Coleraine. And if there were, the corporation decreed that such course may be taken for vindication of the franchises and privileges of this corporation as shall be fitting. Likewise, it was written into Londonderry's charter that no other market could be held within 7 miles of that city, as such competition might attract traders and customers alike away from their town and its fairs and markets. So people from outside the town may say, well, it's handier to go to a market which is 4 miles away from us rather than Derry, which is 7 miles away from us, or whatever it may have been. So they were very, very zealous about guarding their rights and privileges when they were granted a license to have a market or whatever. A market created in Dundrum in County Down in 1629 was, it was stated, for the public good of the inhabitants residing in or near Dundrum, and with the intention that they may have free trade and commerce among themselves and with other liege subjects. So it wasn't just for people who were living in the town, it was also people who were living in the hinterland, but also other liege subjects, in other words, people from further away than just in Dundrum and its hinterland. And although this seems to point towards its use by British settlers in the town and surrounding countryside, the Gaelic Irish were also participating fully in the market and fair system. That markets attracted an influx of Gaelic Irish people to a town is clear when we consider the plan which was hatched by the conspirators of the 1641 Rising. Rory O'Moore and Conor Maguire, two of the ringleaders of that plot, were to bring 200 men, Gaelic Irishmen, into Dublin on a Saturday, which was a market day, so the men would be hidden in plain sight. And led by Maguire and O'Moore, they would take Dublin Castle. This was the plan. That they believed that such a number of Gaelic Irish strangers could go unremarked in the city on a market day points to the wide range and variety of people who would visit the markets, either to sell or to buy or both. The Gaelic Irish in Cavan, for example, were prepared to walk their cattle to Dublin, where they would receive better prices for their livestock at market. They would most likely also probably try their luck at Kells weekly market as well, and possibly Navan as well along the way. And the one in Kells, for example, specialised in corn and cattle by the late 17th century. And Moneymore in County Londonderry in the early days of the Rising was noted to be as full of Irish as if it had been a market day, again pointing to the participation of Gaelic Irish in the market and fair system. So the Gaelic Irish are coming into town on those particular days to buy and sell. The ironmongers were informed by the representative in Derry that the Irish have no monies till their cows be fat, so I'm compelled to take pawns from them in place of rent, again indicating the Gaelic Irish market involvement and their integration into a cash economy. A grey merchant and a tobacco merchant, both Gaelic Irish, were also operating in Belturbet in 1641. But Gaelic involvement in market towns was not new to the 17th century, and some Gaelic towns like Cavan, Granard and Longford had held commercial markets since at least the 15th century. Indeed, the development of the trading and market centre of Cavan town has been described as the only example of what could be called town development in a Gaelic lordship at this time. These Gaelic Irish markets were felt to be drawing both Old English and Gaelic Irish customers and traders to them, to the detriment of the Pale economy. And towns in the Marcher regions between the Pale and Gaelic Ireland, like say Mullingar, were suffering economically because of these Gaelic markets. And that resulted in a statute which was passed by Parliament in 1479 in Ireland, which stated that no English merchant shall take any goods or merchandise to any of the said markets of Cavan, Granard, Longford, or to any country out of the English country, or carry any goods from the said markets, or make any concourse or resort to them, on pain of forfeiture of the said goods and merchandise and their bodies at the King's will. The development of this market in Cavan and in other Longford towns coincided with the introduction of what was called O'Reilly's money. Now, this coinage, although it was counterfeit, was an attempt to ape the market and commercial systems utilised by the people of the Pale and the Anglicised towns. And it seems as well that a sophisticated market system also emerged in the lordship of Tyrconnell in the Tudor period, and they were trading foodstuffs like salmon, herrings and hides for wine, clothes, weapons and armour with France, England and Scotland. And in 1587, Hugh O'Neill, the Earl of Tyrone, was granted the right to hold fairs, again indicating the interest which the Gaelic Irish had in this commercial sphere and their wish to be part of it. Now, such was the money to be made at markets and fairs that there was always the threat of fraudulent practice. And in Coleraine in 1623, the corporation decreed that no Irish cloth be sold without first being checked by the corporation due to differences in the measures between the Gaelic Irish and the English. Complaints were also made in 1637 of forestalling by corn merchants in Westmeath markets as well as in Clonmel in 1623. The forestalling seems to have been a common enough complaint, and a similar issue was noted in Coleraine regarding the inflation of prices. And in 1646, merchants there were bulk buying butter to the extent that there wasn't enough for the townspeople to buy at market. What little there was seems to have been sold at a higher rate than normal, a practice which was outlawed by the corporation. But the problem seems to have continued because again in 1664, Colerane's corporation decreed that merchants were to supply the market with butter at 2 pence per pound, again implying that there was some element of price fixing going on there. A similar operation seems to have been taking place in Clonmel, where in 1636 the corporation ordered that the fishermen were not to group together and sell their wares at inflated prices. Nor were market agents themselves always above any wrongdoing, and in 1705 Belturbet Corporation devised a fine for customs masters or their officers who took advantage of the merchants there by fraudulently overcharging on tolls or customs. So everybody, it seems, was trying to get a piece of the action and trying to profit in whatever way they could. Now, not all of the merchants at these fairs were local, and it's been recently demonstrated by Raymond Gillespie in an article in a book that I edited a few years ago on Ulster Plantation towns. The traders operating at different levels could travel long distances across Ireland to buy and sell at various markets and fairs. So they would go to one market or fair that was on the 1st of May, and then they travel on to the next town who was having a fair 3 days later, and they would do, kind of tours of Ireland, hitting different fairs and markets as they went around. So they knew what days these things were on, and they would go there to hit those days and to buy and sell at these markets. In the 1660s, for example, Mullingar's livestock fair was known as far afield as County Down, and people from Down would visit Mullingar to buy and sell livestock. As the Ulster Plantation progressed, landlords began to demand more rent in cash rather than in goods, and as a result, many tenants had to become involved in markets and trade, in order to actually sell things to make actual money, cash money. And tenants on one Down estate asked for more time to pay their rent. They asked to be allowed to sell some of the produce at nearby fairs, and once they had a chance to sell that produce at the fairs, they would then be able to pay in cash their landlord. And as a result of this dependence on market towns, many of the settlers lived within walking distance of these towns, with the less cash-dependent Irish generally living further away. Certain markets, normally the larger ones, would have luxury goods or specializations, and it was often necessary to travel further in order to purchase these items. They'd have to go to bigger fairs or markets to get these. And there are household accounts dating from 1309 for the Mortimer family in Ardmulken and Meath, points to goods being bought at markets in Ardmulken and nearby Navan, but also in Trim and Dublin, which are about 20 kilometres and 50 kilometres away from where the Mortimers lived. So the Mortimers weren't above sending off their staff to buy at markets which were much further away, but which had the particular items or goods that they wanted. But the merchants and tradesmen who were established in the towns, possibly, as I say, with their own commercial premises, guarded their interests jealously, and sometimes protested at the attempts by outside traders to come into the towns and operate there on fairs and market days. And in Coleraine in 1666, the freemen butchers there petitioned the corporation that the country butchers not be allowed to sell their meat until 11 and to stop at 2, which were shorter hours than those accorded to the town butchers. So again, this notion that the country butchers are coming in on fair days and market days into town, and then maybe undercutting or rivaling the guys who are already in town and settled in the town. Belfast's corporation in 1639 ordered that strangers pay more in customs than local freemen. And in 1650, Adam Carnes, who is described as a foreigner, was fined 20 shillings sterling by Colerane's corporation for selling to other foreigners at market. Nor were peddlers, who were kind of travelling tradesmen, always permitted to trade in towns either. And in 1637, merchants in Ulster complained of Scottish peddlers who smuggled goods into the province, and free of the charges which regular tradespeople were subject to in town markets and fairs, they could undercut the local merchants, and that was causing considerable anger. The Irish Commission of 1622 noted a fall in Irish customs revenue, which they partly blamed on the scaring off of foreign merchants by the troublemaking of the townsfolk. So foreign merchants or outside merchants who were coming in were oftentimes being chased out of town again by probably the resident merchants who were there. They also noted, the Irish Commission in 1622 also noted the strangers, what they termed as strangers, paid roughly 1/3 of the customs while doing a quarter more trading than the Gaelic Irish. The Commission criticised the negative effect which the actions of many of the town corporations had on customs revenue, noting that the troubles and exaction by sundry corporations to all merchants, as well native as strangers, coming to trade among them. So the Commission believed that they were charging too much on traders and merchants, and thereby they were putting off people coming to the towns to buy and sell, and that was then cutting the customs revenue that was being taken in. So the Commission didn't like that. At least some of these restrictions were eased, however, and in 1652, Colerane's corporation declared that the market should be free to all foreign merchants for 2 hours on Tuesdays and Saturdays from 10 to 12, and for 4 hours on Thursdays. Although by 1656, the Coleraine corporation again barred peddlers and grey merchants from taking part in their fairs and their markets. So in conclusion, the markets and the towns which built up around these markets created the conditions required for people from the countryside to visit the towns, give them a reason to visit the towns. The fairs and markets were a regular occasion for rural dwellers either to buy or sell produce or both, and was a very profitable venture for towns to be involved in. Small wonder then that the towns guarded these markets and the rights associated with them so zealously. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Brendan. And we have lots of questions, and just to say there's over 200 people with us today, so we've lots of questions coming in. We have about 14 questions there, and they've come in order really, so they tend to be sort of with relevance to Raymond's bit first, so we might just take it like that. So I just see you're unmuted. So Raymond, the first question for yourself. You talked about 3 mills in the town. Are those mills owned by the town or are they private?
Okay, we know there are 3 mills because the civil survey says there were 3 mills in the town. But the problem with the civil survey is it doesn't tell us who owned it. Now, we can make a guess in this because the law said that control of the grinding of grain was a matter for the landlord. So there were manorial mills in most of which were owned by the landlord, or more often leased out by him. So they would be run privately, and the landlord would take a rake off or a fee for letting it out. The corporation in other towns ran mills as well, simply in order to make money. But we don't know usually, well, certainly we don't know for a time who actually owned the mills. But we could make a very good guess that it was in at least one case the corporation, and probably in other 2 cases the private individuals.
Okay, thank you, Raymond. And as I say, we'll stick with yourself for the moment for the first sets of questions. And just to say, we have gone beyond 2 o'clock now. But we are going to stay and take these questions for until about 2:15, 2:20. So please stay with us, or feel free to go. You will be able to catch up on this at a later date and watch it online if you have to leave. So another question for yourself, Raymond. Do we know if any lawyers represented clients in the manorial courts? And if so, were they lawyers from the city?
No, in the main, manorial courts are very low-key affairs. They're not about enforcing the law as we would understand it. They are about enforcing local custom, or what people think the word should operate on. So they tend not to have lawyers there. In some cases, there are a few lawyers who turn up on very special occasions. But in the few manor courts that we do have, we don't know about lawyers. One very interesting case is the case of Finnevara in County Clare, which is on the Thomond estate. And there on the juries, not actually appearing before the court, but on the juries of the court, there is a very high proportion of Magaedagons. Now, the Magaedagons were a traditional Gaelic law family from that area. And it looks as though these people have sort of sidestepped from Brehon law into common law, and they move seamlessly without difficulty. Now, that having been said, they're not arguing before the people, but these are the people who are making the decisions. These are the juries who are making the decisions. But most of the law which is applied in the manor courts is simply the landlord trying to sort out, who owns the lease, who has hit who on a Friday night outside the pub. I mean, that's the level at which the manor courts work. So really, lawyers don't tend to get involved. It's not grand enough for lawyers.
Okay, thanks, Raymond. Another one, and this refers back to one of our earlier papers from Con Manning at Raymond. With the number of yeomen and farmers in many towns you described, would some of them, like Lurgan, even qualify as a town, according to Howard Clark's definition, as we heard in the first session?
Yes, I mean, I think Howard's definition of village versus a town. A village certainly is the case in Lurgan, whereas a town, I think, is probably more appropriate for a town. I think the very important distinction here is about time, and that this is why I drew the quite severe distinction between the areas where there are no late medieval towns and the areas where there are medieval towns. So that in Ulster, for example, in Connaught, in the 17th century, as the economy commercializes, so you're getting towns founded for the first time. So certainly in the early 17th century, you are getting towns which are progressing through villages, up into towns, up into something bigger. So Belfast, for example, which is not part of the plantation, but it's part of that indirect colonisation scheme. Belfast starts off as a parish church, not even a parish church, a chapel, about 1603. By 1640, it's a relatively substantial settlement. And by 1700, they are talking about, Belfast as the second largest port in Ireland. Now it's not, but people can believe that. In fact, they can believe it suggests this is their perception. So that it really depends at what point you measure these things. And certainly what I was doing, I think for effect, as much as anything else, was to contrast Lurgan and Tye. These sort of they're certainly villages in Ulster, but they will become quite substantial towns. Because by 1700, Lurgan and Tye are roughly the same size. So, yes, you're quite right. But these things are dynamic. And this world is changing, so that what you're getting in terms of a town, what a town consists of in say 1620, is not what it consists of in 1660. So what I'm trying to talk about 200 years, there is, within the broad frame I'm talking about, quite substantial change in the nature of the urban network, for example. So therefore, a great deal is happening.
Okay, thank you, Raymond. And there's some quite long questions coming in, and we'll come back to those, I think, at the end if we've got time. I hope we do. Was there any antagonism between rural and urban dwellers when they met in towns? any conflict based on nationality or religion. Raymond, maybe you go for that first.
Yeah, I mean, I think I've never seen any evidence of riots or violence which juxtaposes town against country. I mean, in as clear a position that there is an awful lot of interdependence. So it's not, as clear as now. There are people who come into towns, who go to the pub, who get drunk, and there are punch-ups outside. I mean, there's no doubt at all about that. And whether that's nationality or religion, well, that's a matter for debate. You do get in some towns, for example, you do get people arguing about religion on the streets. And indeed, there's one quite well-known example in the early 17th century where a Franciscan friar is actually debating with people on a market day outside in a whole series of languages. So you're actually seeing people from very diverse backgrounds mingling. And when you get that happen, you do get violence, whether it's because they've been to the pub or whether it's because, they meet somebody they don't like, or, something else happens. But I've never seen any evidence of, the Catholics in the countryside being beaten up by the Protestants in the town. I've never seen it as neat as that, because it's not, I don't think it's quite as clear as that.
Okay, thanks, Raymond. And we might, there's another question coming up for you, but we might go to Brendan now. Deirdre's asking, and I think this is in reference to the church, why east facing? Was this the custom to face the rising sun? So that's one for you, Brendan, but I might also just go to another question, Brendan, if you can keep that. That's about the church and east facing the rising sun. And then Owen Barrett asks, is there any evidence for travelling merchants in the early 17th century being bilingual? And is there any evidence for Gaelic doctors in that period having patients in the town? So sorry, there's a few things there for you, Brendan. Maybe you could get started on those.
Well, so I'll tackle the bilingual thing first. There's an example of a in the 1641 depositions of a Gaelic Irish guy who is traveling from various parts of the country, and he's going up to Dublin, and he's in Ulster, and he's in various parts of the country, and I think it kind of stands to reason that there would have been a certain amount of bilingualism going on. I mean, it's generally implicit, I suppose, because again, when you look at some of the depositions in the 1640s, the English settlers are speaking to the Gaelic Irish insurgents, and somebody is speaking English and somebody is speaking Irish, and you do see sometimes as well in the depositions, you'll find people, English settlers, reciting lines of Irish or little phrases of Irish and things like that. So I think it's probably fair to say that if you're a Gaelic Irishman who wants to sell your cattle to an English settler, you'd probably want to learn some English, so you can make the sale. So I think it stands to reason that there would have been a certain amount of bilingualism there. In relation to the doctors visiting the towns, I'm not aware of evidence there, but Raymond may have something on that, I don't know. And then in relation to the churches, churches are generally east facing, as the lady said, part of the thing was facing the rising sun, but also facing Jerusalem as well. So, yeah.
Okay, do you want to come in there, Raymond?
Okay. I mean, just on the question of language, the case Brendan's referring to is a man called Shra, who comes from Tipperary, and he comes north, and he goes to Enniskillen, he goes to Clogher, he goes around a whole series of things, selling cloth that he's bought in Tipperary, and then he goes to Belturbet, or goes to Cavan, and back then to. But what's interesting about him is that he says the deposition which he gives in 1641 has to be done by a translator. In other words, he has no English, none. So I mean, this clearly, being monolingual Irish, clearly doesn't incredibly handicap you in this sort of world. Although there is the very interesting case of that text, Parliament Clan Thomas, the Parliament of Clan Thomas, which is a satire on the Irish, where at the end, two Irishmen want the perfect consumer product, the thing you need to show off above all others, and that is tobacco. And to get tobacco, you need to be able to speak English. And one of them says, I can speak English. And of course, what is written in the text is garbage. But yet, this is the satire on this guy who is, the bee's knees and knows everything and can buy his tobacco. But again, English is the language that, because the merchants can't speak Irish, but English is the language they use. And this is exactly the idea underlying when in the plantation they say, how will we bring the native Irish on board, send them to the market? Because they pick up new ideas there. Send them to the assize, because that's where they go to the common law. That's where they learn how the world works. So and all these things happen in towns. So towns are the ultimate element of civilization. Gaelic doctors, yes, there are lots of them. Some are in the towns. Thomas Arthur is perhaps the best known one in Limerick, who has patients, all over the place.
Okay, thank you, Raymond. And going back to Brendan, market holders, do we know what fees the market holders were charged for their stalls on market and fair days?
We do now. I can't think of the fees off the top of my head. I know, like in the minute book for the Belturbet Corporation, it gives the fees for someone who's laying down what I think the phrase kind of flat on the ground. So they're, they don't have a stall as such. They're just putting their stuff probably on some kind of a blanket or whatever it is, and they're charged less than the guys who have the larger stalls, which kind of stands to reason, I suppose. Now, what those exact fees are off the top of my head, I can't recall, but it certainly would have been cheaper. So if you only had a few bits, if you weren't, say, a permanent trader or a permanent market man, like you're going in every week, and you just had a few bits that you had extras there or whatever, you could go in, set up a little small in a corner somewhere, and you wouldn't be charged as much as the guy who was there every week in, week out, and who had a stall and could set up and do all of that. So it was cheaper to do it that way. But as I say, I'm not sure of the numbers just off the top of my head.
Okay, and just while you're there, Brendan, please, we have a question coming in about what conditions prevailed for wool merchants, and then another attendee saying, Brendan, thanks for a fascinating talk. Can you expand on the nature of the peddlers and what reasons caused them to be barred from markets, please? So we're a question about wool merchants and the conditions for them, and also the peddlers and what reasons caused them to be barred from markets.
Okay, I'm not quite sure about the wool merchants. What the question means. If I can get some kind of just an explanation. I'm not just sure what that's referring to. What the conditions were, like how much they had to sell or how much they had to pay, or I'm not quite sure. But so if we can get some clarification on that, that'd be great. But the peddlers were like there's like an order of merchants, and peddlers were typically down near the lower rung of the merchant ladder, and they were kind of semi-itinerant tradespeople who would go from A to B and would go around, and they were the lower kind of rung of the ladder. And there's plenty of examples of people complaining, particularly in Ulster, of Scottish peddlers coming over for the day, selling, maybe around the outskirts of town or whatever, and then nicking back over again. And so, in other words, the problem that the merchants had with that was they weren't. The merchants were saying that the peddlers weren't paying, the fees that they had to pay, which is something that you still hear things like that now. Like where I grew up, there used to always be a complaint from the shopkeepers that the guy who would come with the fruit and veg stall on a Thursday and set up behind the town hall, he didn't have to pay the full rates, whereas the other person who was selling fruit and veg in the shop 100 meters away had to pay a full rates for the right to do it. So I think it's a complaint over, well, we have to pay, our rates for this, but the peddler is getting away with it. So there was always that kind of, there was that grey area So for example, if you're walking into a town and there's a peddler selling you something at a lower price than the guy who's in the middle of the town in the marketplace, who do you buy it off? I suppose. So that was the main complaint that they had about that.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. And would the markets have been an opportunity to buy and sell services as well as goods? I'm imagining possibly things like manual labour, tailor, smith work, prostitution, tutoring or children, animal veterinary or stud services, or other types of services facilitated between town and country dwellers.
I think it's safe to assume that. If you look at any kind of a market, there's always all these other people, that are around, and I think it's safe to assume that because it's a great meeting place, the market, and that as Raymond mentioned a minute ago, I mean the whole idea, whether the Gaelic Irish learn their manners or their language or their new language and these sort of things, their new customs, they learn it in the marketplace. So if you're somebody who has a skill that you want to sell, I mean, just think of the hiring fairs. Like if you're someone who has something that you want to sell, or you have a skill, or you want to get hired, and you want to go somewhere where people are in the business of buying and selling, you would go to the market. So I think it's fair to say that would have been, certainly the case. Yeah.
Okay, thanks, Brendan. And we are just running out of time now, but Jennifer has said if there's outstanding questions, could you please, we'll take one more for Brendan and Raymond, but could you please email your questions to ihta@ria.ie, please, and we'll get back to you that way. Or with Raymond and Brendan, we'll get back to you. We'll pass that on to them. So I'm sorry, we haven't been able to deal with everything today. So we'll just go to this. So Brendan, how did a Bishop Landowner Corporation secure letters patent to establish fairs and markets? Would they need to make a case for establishing a market and fair, or did they use their connections with the Dublin Executive or royal courtiers in Whitehall to secure a patent? And the same, Liam also has a question for Raymond. Hi, Ray. How did people in the countryside hear about a forthcoming market or fair? Were such notices disseminated through the rural clergy during divine worship or mass, or did the local landowners notify their tenants? So first part of the question for Brendan about letters patent, and the second part about how people heard about.
Okay. Thanks, Sarah. Right. Well, yeah, there would have been a mixture of things like that. I mean, it was most people who were setting up towns from the Anglo-Norman period, from with their manor town and so on. They would be looking to get a market set up in the town because it was a source of revenue for them and their family after them. So they would have wanted one. So but it was also in the interest of the government to have markets set up as well, and the whole issuing of charters, which happens wholesale in the early 17th century. There's also the political point there that they're trying to pack Parliament with new Protestant MPs and so on. So there would have been a certain amount of it was in the town's interest to have a market, but it was also oftentimes in the government's interest to have the market there as well. And so you would make representations, and if some money passed hands as well, it may smooth the thing over a wee bit more as well. So you would have had to pay for the right to have it as well. But as I say, it was often in the government interest, almost just as much as the town itself, to have a market there.
Thanks, Brendan. And Raymond, do you want to say something about how people heard about things?
I mean, just on the technicalities of this, you don't actually get a patent to hold a fair or a market. What you get is a patent to hold a market court, which will deal with the legal business. If there's a row over buying and selling, which inevitably there is, it's the court that sorts that out, and the court is a source of revenue. So therefore, what landlords want is the right to hold a court, and that comes from the king, because all justice relies on the king. I mean, so that the king grants you the right to hold a market court, and you will make profit from that. And in return, you should pay to the king a sum of money for the right to hold a market court. So therefore you would apply, and if no one else had taken out a grant, and remember, this is not connected necessarily with land ownership. Someone who does not own the town can have can run the manor court. So it's really quite a complicated thing at the end of the day. So that you apply, and then the legal, if no one else has applied, the legal process has gone through, you pay your fees, and you get the grant. Sometimes it's speculative, sometimes you do nothing with it, sometimes it does develop into something, sometimes you try, and sometimes it fails. How do people get to hear about market courts? In the late 17th century, they get to hear about it through things called almanacs, which are produced by Dublin, the printers in Dublin, and there are some early 17th century ones as well, but they're principally late 17th century ones, which have lists of where the markets and particularly where the fairs are. Because again, going back to what Brendan was talking about earlier on, people move around these fairs, in sort of circles. So they go to Cavan Fair on Monday, Ahar Fair on Tuesday. So the almanac is what tells you what is on where. So the almanac's important. Before that, we simply don't know. But it seems to be that it's more word of mouth. The people, it's nice to have your friends into the market and so on, but the people they really want in are big merchants who will buy stuff at the fair, who will buy the cattle and so on. And the way you get those is simply word of mouth. You put that word out through the merchant, and you say, have you heard there's a new fair in Dungannon or wherever it might be? There might be bargains to be picked up, and so they go. So it's principally word of mouth. And then after that, you're talking about, other people will hear and they will come in for the entertainment or whatever else, is going on in the fair.
Okay, thank you. And I'm afraid we'll have to leave it at that for today. We still have questions coming in, and I think that's a tribute to today's paper in itself. Please put those, anything we haven't answered, in an email to ihta@ria.ie, and also all this feedback and the interest will feed into the book Town and Country, and Raymond and Brendan are preparing a chapter on that topic for that, so I'm sure they'll have found the questions interesting as well. So sincere thanks to Raymond and Brendan for their work in preparing their paper for today, and thank you very, very much for all of that. Thank you also to Jennifer and to Alan for their continuing hard work on the production of all this, to our editor Michael Potterton for his ongoing support of the series, and indeed to the full IHTA board, and to you, our virtual audience, for joining and being so engaged with the papers today. We're looking forward to seeing you all again next week, I hope. Same day and time, Thursday the 27th of May at 1 o'clock for the next instalment. And we're moving on again from outlying villages to townships, Dublin suburbs in the 19th century. And that's with Ruth McManus, Seamus O'Matthew, Frank Cullen and Colm Lennon, so a treat in store there. And that evening, same day, 27th of May at 7 p.m, we will round things off with our plenary session with Professor Chris Dyer on medieval towns, why we need to take account of the country. And that session will be chaired by Professor Keith Lilly of Queen's University Belfast and the chair of the British Historic Towns Atlas, and will be introduced by the President of the Royal Irish Academy, Dr. Mary Canning. So one booking on Eventbrite covers the whole seminar, so you can keep booking or tell your friends, and you should receive the link in time for next Thursday. What else is there to say? Also, if you're new to the IHTA, please do check out ihta.ie, our webpage, and you can access information about the printed fascicles there, and also about IHTA online. So a lot of our material is now online. Highly recommended. So thank you again, Raymond, Brendan, and to everybody who joined us today. Goodbye and see you next week.